Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung has officially kicked off 2026 with a symbolic visit to China, calling it the start of a full restoration in Korea-China ties. In his first state visit since taking office and the first by a Korean president to Beijing in 9 years. In talks with President Xi, Lee emphasized trust, strategic partnership, and a new phase of cooperation from diplomacy and security to economic and cultural ties as well. For a closer look into the bilateral relations and beyond, we connect to Joel Atkinson, professor of the School of International and Area Studies at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. A big welcome, Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
And also joining us is Hana Kim, associate professor at Sogang University's GSIS. Good to see you, Professor.
Thanks for having me again.
So let's start with Professor Atkinson. Like I said, President Lee's latest visit to China is the first such visit by a Korean leader in 9 years. Why do you think China has been chosen as the first destination of the new year, and what kind of broader message does this show?
Yes, well, there was a reciprocity issue, which meant he couldn't go last year. Xi Jinping visited way back in 2014. And then President Park Geun-hye visited 2015, attending the Beijing military parade. And then she went again in 2016 for the G20 summit. But that was also the year that Park allowed US forces Korea to install a THAAD missile defense unit. And along with the economic coercion in response to that, excuse me, she apparently also refused to come back to Korea for another visit. And then this is a long story. Following Park's impeachment, President Moon Jae-in went to China in 2017. He was then criticized by conservative critics for what they saw as his kind of disrespectful treatment he received, eating noodles alone, that kind of thing. And then Moon went back again in 2019 for a trilateral summit. And meanwhile, Xi still hadn't come. And then the Yoon administration kind of insisted that Xi Jinping had to come first before Yoon went there. Xi wouldn't do that, so there were no visits during the Yoon administration, the short-lived Yoon administration. And then the new Lee Jae Myung administration was very focused on getting Xi Jinping here to Korea, which he did last year for APEC. And now Lee's been very fast to get to China as soon as he could this year. So yeah, it is diplomatically significant. It shows that China is willing to restore a basic level of cooperation with Korea in terms of these kinds of visits, which it hadn't been willing to do after THAAD.
Definitely. So it really shows how much weight Seoul is placing on Beijing right now. And in fact, President Lee actually called this latest summit the start of a full restoration in Korea-China relationship. And it's only been 2 months since the last meeting. But based on, the tone and positioning, Professor Kim, do you think it feels like a real shift in direction from us?
I think Professor Atkinson mentioned how this is the start of basic cooperation, and to a certain extent I agree, because it seems that calling it a restoration might be a bit of a stretch at this point. At this stage, Korea-China relations appear to be in a cautious but also tangible phase that seems to be more focused on recovery rather than restoration. Of course, the fact that President Lee Jae Myung's 4-day visit to Beijing comes just 2 months after the bilateral meeting in Gyeongju and during APEC, it signals that both governments are making a deliberate effort to restore high-level diplomatic momentum. And the rapid sequencing of summitry itself is significant, and it suggests a shared recognition that relations had fallen below a mutually acceptable baseline. So to a certain extent, yes, things are improving. Politically, both sides have emphasized stability and mutual respect, and the meeting with Xi Jinping reinforces this message that Beijing is willing to engage Seoul as a serious partner again. And economically also, there's a renewed interest in cooperation on trade, investment, and people-to-people exchanges. So, and this had been stagnant in recent years. Now, of course, there are still a lot of structural constraints. sensitive issues such as semiconductor supply chain, security alignment with the United States, North Korea's nuclear modernization, and unresolved cultural and regulatory frictions continue to limit how far the so-called restoration and can realistically go in the near term. So, we are still waiting for updates from the summit, but under the current circumstances, I would imagine that the current phase can be best understood as a stabilization and partial repair of relations, which could then potentially lay out the groundwork for future progress.
Right, so we're really seeing some progress, some recovery, but still there seems to be a long road to full restoration, it seems. Now, let's move on to the security aspect. Denuclearization was deemed a main issue, but North Korea apparently launched a missile just before the talks. So, Professor Atkinson, what message do you think was Pyongyang trying to send at this time around?
Well, if there is a signal, I guess it's that Pyongyang is it's saying it won't be affected by any cooperation between South Korea and China, that it will continue to develop and display its nuclear and missile capabilities, that it will not be, controlled by South Korea through Beijing, and that any arms control agreement is going to be between North Korea and the US as equals. So, yeah, none of which is a surprise, of course.
But ahead of this latest summit, South Korea's presidential office actually called for China to play a bigger role when it comes to North Korea. Professor Kim, given this latest provocation, do you think Beijing might actually step up?
As President Lee Jae Myung's call for China to play a constructive role on the Korean Peninsula reflects a long-standing expectation in Seoul. And I think considering what we're hearing about the recent updates regarding the summit, we are getting news that Lee Jae Myung mentioned working together for the resolution of the North Korean issue. But still, the likelihood that China will take on a more active role on the North Korean issue, even after the summit, is likely to remain a bit limited. In fact, in recent years, Beijing's position on the peninsula has noticeably shifted in a way that suggests somewhat avoiding the push for denuclearization. For example, Chinese official statements have increasingly downplayed or omitted explicit references to denuclearization, and they have instead emphasized concepts such as stability, crisis management, and the prevention of escalation. And this rhetorical shift suggests that China now prioritizes managing risks and preserving the status quo over actively pushing for North Korea's denuclearization. So as a result, we're seeing that Beijing is appearing to regard this as increasingly unrealistic under the current conditions. And as a result of this recent transition, the outcome of the Korea-China summit is unlikely to fundamentally or drastically alter this calculus. Ultimately, China remains willing to engage diplomatically and reiterate general support for peace and dialogue, but there's little indication that it's prepared to exert meaningful leverage over Pyongyang or to re-embrace denuclearization as an urgent policy objective.
Right, so China's also considering its own interests as well in this aspect. Now, the West Sea structures, China's West Sea structures, and Korea's nuclear submarine plans were also believed to be on the agenda for talks. Professor Atkinson, do you think the summit could have actually helped manage any of that friction?
I think, Beijing sees those West Sea structures as legitimate, as its own business. I suspect it won't matter what Seoul says or how often it raises the issue. The situation with those structures will change according to Beijing's own timeline. And so far, Beijing's language about the nuclear submarines has been rather muted. Perhaps this is because it's satisfied with Seoul's assurances that developing that capability is about enhancing Korea's autonomy, not containing China, or maybe because Beijing doesn't actually expect the plan to go ahead anytime soon.
So you're not expecting as much results from this latest meeting?
I think, in the initial reporting on the statements they've made, there's nothing concrete there. and I haven't seen them mention the West Sea structures or the nuclear submarines. The one thing that did, I wouldn't exactly call it progress, but I did see in the earlier reporting that's come out that Xi Jinping talked about, I think it was making accurate and correct strategic choices. And he said firmly safeguarding the direction of friendly cooperation. So you can read those as, in effect, warnings for President Lee to keep moving in the direction Beijing wants it to move strategically.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that we have to talk about when it comes to bilateral ties between Seoul and Beijing is cultural exchanges. President Lee stressed the need for horizontal cooperation tied to real-life issues. Professor Kim, how likely is it that cultural exchanges will really kind of bounce back to before, and what might get in the way?
I would hope that there would be more cultural exchanges, and in many ways, the Korea-China summit can potentially create a more favorable political environment for the gradual resumption of cultural and people-to-people exchanges. That being said, progress is likely to be very incremental and selective. Now, China has increasingly treated cultural exchanges as a policy tool rather than a purely social or market-driven phenomenon. And this means that progress will depend less on bilateral goodwill alone and more on Beijing's broader political and strategic calculations. Now, for example, domestic considerations within China, such as content regulation, public opinion management, and the state's increasing emphasis on cultural sovereignty will continue to constrain how far people-to-people exchanges can expand. Likewise, developments in security and technology issues such as US-China strategic competition and Korea's alignment choices will also indirectly affect the scope of cultural openness. So as a result of this, this increasing relationship between South Korea and China and the summit also may potentially help restart cultural and human exchanges, particularly in tourism, as we've seen recently, also academic cooperation as well, and limited entertainment activities. But a genuine and sustained revival of Korean wave-related exchanges, including Korean dramas and everything else, will depend not only on bilateral diplomacy, but also on China's internal policy priorities and the wider regional strategic environment.
Right, so it's quite a complex situation, and we have to take into consideration domestic politics, geopolitical situation, and a lot of things to bounce back to the cultural cooperation that we've seen before. Now, the two sides also apparently discussed follow-up measures on last year's supply chain and AI cooperation MOUs. Professor Atkinson, so in the middle of the U.S.-China rivalry we're seeing, how crucial is this kind of cooperation with China? And do you think it complicates Korea's alliance with Washington?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's crucial in terms of needing to make progress on it. There's already a kind of a baseline of cooperation there, which is very important to both sides. Kind of increasing that cooperation is more difficult. President Lee has emphasized he wants to maximize beneficial opportunities for Korean companies with China, but China is a tough negotiator. If he is willing to push the limits of what the Americans would tolerate in terms of tech controls, or if he allows more tech transfers from Korea to China, maybe at the expense of future competitiveness of South Korean companies, or if he's willing to increase access for Chinese companies in the South Korean market, maybe in sensitive sectors, in the services, then Beijing will see the benefit in the cooperation. But if it's just to try to open up market opportunities for Korean companies, or to benefit from all of that investment in technology that China's done to transfer tech from China to Korea, then I don't expect Beijing's going to be particularly interested.
Mm-hmm. What about on the alliance with Washington? Do you think it will affect it?
It affects it considerably, because there's certain limits to what kind of cooperation South Korea can engage in. There's limits to what it can do in terms of semiconductors. And certainly Beijing will be putting that proposal to the South Korean side that if they want to see more opportunities, more cooperation in other areas, then they need to push harder on the Americans and to allow greater access to some of that technology.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor, let's also touch upon the sensitive issue on Taiwan and the One China principle. So as for South Korea, it's balancing between powers. What do you think is the most sensitive issue that it needs to handle very carefully at this time?
Yes, well, South Korea has a One China policy, which is different to Beijing's One China principle. And so far, President Lee has been careful to maintain that distinction. And this is certainly something that Beijing expects Seoul to manage carefully if it wants cooperation in other areas to continue. And so far, Beijing, I think, has been quite satisfied with what Lee has been saying about Taiwan, especially in contrast to previous President Yoon Suk-yeol and the current Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae. So, you know, on the other side, of course, is if he goes too far in accommodating Beijing's demands, and if South Korea's Seoul's not seen as contributing to deterring China from using force or the threats of force against Taiwan, then he will not only hurt relations with Taiwan, which is an important economic partner in terms of semiconductors, etc., but also, you know, it could hurt cooperation with Washington and Tokyo.
Right, so really careful calibration will be key as these issues heat up regionally. Now, finally, before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor Kim, how do you think can South Korea improve ties with China without undermining its security cooperation with Washington and Tokyo?
I think in many ways, South Korea, as a so-called middle power, is always stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to maintaining relations with the United States and Japan, but also with China. You know, and so as of the current situation and the current environment, as South Korea works to improve relations with China, it should pursue a principled and transparent diplomatic approach rather than one based on strategic ambiguity or ad hoc balancing, which we may have seen in the past. You know, strengthening ties with Beijing, hopefully, or I think what South Korea needs to show is that strengthening ties with Beijing does not require weakening trilateral security cooperation with the United States and Japan. But of course, this is provided that Seoul remains clear and consistent about its core security commitments. You know, for example, Seoul should clearly communicate red lines and enduring principles, including the credibility of the alliance with the United States and opposition to unilateral exchanges to the regional status quo. But at the same time, Seoul should practice strategic consistency and predictability. So in short, South Korea's goal should not be to choose between the trilateral cooperation and China, and diplomacy grounded in firm principles is the most effective way to sustain strong South Korea, US, Japan security cooperation while also pursuing stable and constructive relations with China.
Right, so South Korea is really walking a very fine line, and how it moves forward could really shape the region's balance for years to come. We'll be keeping close eyes on the developments moving forward. But as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion right here. Many thanks for your insights, Professor Kim.
Thank you so much.
And of course, Professor Atkinson, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.